Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to see you all in person on this beautiful afternoon. I'm Gloria Groom, the chair, and David and Mary Winton Green, curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture of Europe, and I am delighted to welcome you to this, our first program for members for the exhibition opening to the general public tomorrow, Canova Sketching in Clay. As we begin, a brief reminder to please turn off anything that makes noise. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this afternoon's program and the curator of the exhibition, Emerson Bowyer. Emerson is the Searle Curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture of Europe, and he is a specialist in 18th and 19th century French and British art. He previously was a curator at the Frick Collection, the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. I first met Emerson 10 years ago when he gave a few of us a tour of the exhibition he had curated at the Frick of the sculptor, early 19th century, late 18th century sculpture of medallions and monuments, David d'Angers. Since then, he has curated and written for catalogs for a number of exhibitions, including the groundbreaking and highly provocative Like Life, Sculpture, Color, and the Body, which was held at the Met at the Breuer Building on Madison Avenue in 2018. And it was this exhibition that he was preparing for when he literally accepted our call and jumped ship to come to work for us. We love it when New York gives us someone. I hope you've already seen the exhibition Camille Claudel, which opened last month in the Abbott Gallery in the modern wing, and which is already getting rave reviews. For those of you who were fortunate to attend his sold-out members lecture on the Claudel exhibition, you know what an amazing scholar and lecturer Emerson is and why we are so happy that he has chosen Chicago as his adopted city and home. And it is incredible that he was able to curate these two major loan exhibitions almost concurrently, Claudel and the exhibition whose opening we are celebrating today, Canova Sketching in Clay. Please join me in welcoming Emerson to the stage.
Thank you, Gloria. It's so lovely to be here today to discuss Antonio Canova. Forgive me if I accidentally say Claudel. There are a lot of C's going on in my life right now. I've been known to say Canova, which is equally problematic. So I'll do the best that I can not to get confused. Canova Sketching in Clay is the largest American exhibition ever devoted to the celebrated Italian neoclassical sculptor and focuses primarily on process. How do you create a marble sculpture? How do you move from an initial idea to a finished work of art? Canova remains famous today for his exquisitely finished marble statues, such as Psyche revived by Cupid's Kiss. His friend Leopoldo Cicognara described his carving process as a sensuous series of kisses and caresses as he worked to wear down a marble block to reveal a figure. He became the leading sculptor of the neoclassical style, which drew upon the example of ancient Greek and Roman art. He was constantly in demand during his lifetime. The rich, famous, and powerful of Europe, and even America, clamored at the door of his studio to get him to accept commissions from them. But works like Psyche Revived by Cupid's Kiss and Here, the Great Three Graces, did not miraculously emerge fully formed in marble. They began as small and loosely modeled sketches where the artist raced to materialize his ideas in soft, damp clay. These intimate sculptures are more than just a step in the process of creating a work of art. They are works of art in their own right. These vivid works bear the traces of the artist's hands and fingers as he pressed and pinched the material, as well as the gouging and scraping of his tools. Often produced in less than an hour, these sometimes almost frenzied sculptures crackle with energy. Clay sketches were increasingly prized by collectors in 18th century Europe. In 1769, for example, the German archaeologist and art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann argued that for sculptors, sketching in clay is like drawing on paper for a painter. And as the juice from the first pressing of grapes makes the best wine, so the genius of an artist is displayed in all its naturalness and truth in works in soft material or on paper. In other words, sketches provided the most direct evidence of the artist's hand. They also allowed something very special on the part of the viewer of the works. These works, because they are unfinished, they allow us to use our own imagination to activate them and to complete them. So these works are very much become a kind of dialogue between us and what the artist has produced. Other works in clay by Canova, and that you'll see in the exhibition, were more carefully modeled and served as models for finished marble sculptures. And here you see one of the great clay or terracotta heads of Medusa, which this was probably the model, the final model for the great Perseus with the head of the Medusa, which you will probably know from the Met Museum in New York. Our exhibition brings together the largest group of Canova's clay sketches in some 50 years. Clay is a natural material formed by the decomposition of different kinds of rock. When mixed with water, it becomes a thick, malleable substance that can be shaped easily by hand and with tools. It's been used to make sculptures for millennia. Unlike marble carving, in which stone is subtracted from a larger block, sculpting in clay is an additive process in which lumps of the soft material can be pressed together to create forms. Inexpensive and easy to manipulate, clay was an ideal material for sculptors like Canova to develop their compositional ideas, although he had to work quickly. The substance becomes increasingly fragile and brittle as it dries out. Firing the finished model by exposing it to extreme heat in a kiln hardens it into a more durable terracotta, and it's terracottas that you will see in the exhibition in Regenstein. And here are some stills from a remarkable series of videos that we commissioned from a brilliant sculptor in Vermont, Fred Brownstein. And we had cameras, the poor guy, we had cameras in his studio for 4 months earlier this year. He's one of the few sculptors who is able to follow Canova's process from the very first sketches in clay all the way through the technical process of finishing a final marble. These days people use power tools, lasers, things like that. But Fred learned his craft in Carrara, where the great Carrara marble is dug up out of the earth. And so he's been able to use Canova's techniques in this fine series of videos. So I hope that if you haven't seen them, you will spend some time with them in the exhibition, because describing the difficult and technical process of producing a marble is virtually impossible in words. So it's wonderful to see it visually and in motion. This bust, Study of a Boy, began as a heap of moist clay dug out of a bin in Canova's studio and piled onto his modeling stand to create the rough forms of shoulders, neck, and head. Using his hands and tools, Canova added and removed clay, shaped it, smoothed it, and inscribed its surface to gradually refine the figure. Lastly, he applied rolled spaghetti-like strands of clay to the boy's scalp to produce his springy curls. The network of deep cracks that penetrate the surface of the bust occurred during the firing process. Although unintended by the artist, I think they underscore and increase our understanding of the fleeting nature of youth. Now, the firing process is incredibly dangerous in the sense that if the clay is too dense, or if the heat, or if it heats up in different levels at different times, it will either explode or crack. And so you have to take on this amazing level of risk when you work with clay. And Canova probably produced hundreds of clay models over the course of his career. Many of those would have become broken in the firing process, whether he liked it or not. Others, if he wasn't happy with them, he probably would have thrown them back into a bin of water in order to reactivate the clay to use on something else. Of the 60 or so surviving works in clay by Canova, our exhibition gathers over half. Most of these works remained in Canova's studio when he died. They were never publicly exhibited or commercially marketed. They were only partially accessible to visitors in a more private section of his studio. Here is a fabulous painting from the late 19th century, decades after Canova's death, that shows you, the interior of the workshop, which is a little misleading because there would have been, about 20 people working with him as assistants. And here he is as a kind of lone genius. And you see on the shelves terracottas, plasters made from terracottas, and he's standing in front of an over life-size clay model that he is producing himself. Now, most of the small terracotta sketches, and the ones you see up on the shelf in the painting, remained in his studio when he died. The few that escaped the studio were given as gifts by the artist to close friends and patrons. A beautiful example of this is his second known, more advanced study for his great composition, The Three Graces. This beautiful work was gifted by Canova to the reigning beauty in Europe of her time, Juliette Récamier, Madame Récamier, she's known as. And so she held this in her possession for her entire life, for the rest of her life, and then bequeathed it to the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Lyon, in France. And so that's one example of quite a few of works that escaped the studio and it were then passed down through their families or bequeathed like this one to museums. The remainder of Canova's sketches, after he died, entered his remarkable museum in Posagno in Italy. And I don't know if any of you have been there. In northern Italy, it is absolutely remarkable. Now, when the museum opened, and it was the first museum ever to open dedicated to a single artist, and we have many museums like that today, the Munch Museum, et cetera, et cetera. But this was the very first of those. And you see here on the left the display of plaster casts of Canova's models and marbles that are all on display at the museum. And when the museum opened, those were the things that people wanted to see. They wanted to see the finished works and that were as close to marbles as possible. The marbles, of course, had all already got out into the world to those that had commissioned them. But these plasters had remained in the studio. The terracottas, on the other hand, they were sort of hidden away in a little room that visitors didn't sort of even know were there. And it sort of tells you something about the status of the terracotta sketches versus the plasters in the early 19th century. However, by the end of the 19th century, things had started to change. Visitors were increasingly looking to see more direct evidence of an artist's hand. The very idea of the sketch had become very commonplace, very accepted, many people collecting them. And then in the 1950s, the great Italian modernist architect Carlo Scarpa was commissioned to produce an addition to the museum, and you see it there, part of it there on the right. It is an extraordinary achievement. The building is magnificent and served as one of the inspirations for the design of our exhibition. And you see there in fabulous modern glass cases an array of Canova's terracottas. So these started to be prized more than the plasters themselves. And I think that reflects the rise of modernism in art and the idea of sort of the loosely modeled figures and compositions, and the way in which the sort of more emotive qualities of the terracottas were appealing and continue, I think, to appeal to viewers. We were very fortunate to spend many months over the course of 3 years at the Museum in Possagno, and it was an extraordinary experience because we had to be extremely careful. These works are incredibly fragile. And so we had teams of conservators from the NGA in Washington and elsewhere that traveled with us to the museum, and we worked very carefully with the administration of this museum and many others to determine which works were fit for travel. And we were lucky that many of them actually were, and a group of them that we felt were unfit for travel remain in their locations. The son of a stone cutter from Possagno in Italy, and you can see it here west of Venice and quite close to Bassano del Grappa. And that's where the red dot is there. He apprenticed under the sculptor Giuseppe Bernardi, beginning at the age of 13. He later followed Bernardi to Venice, where he created his first independent works. And those are initially in clay. Clay is a lot cheaper for an artist to work in at the beginning of their careers, and they tended only to work in marble once they had an actual commission from someone, so that they had the money to actually purchase the materials and spend the arduous amount of time required to carve. I love this portrait of Canova. Here he is with one of his clay models. You can see it's on the sculpture stand. He's proudly wrapping one arm around it. He's got a modeling tool, a wooden modeling tool in the other hand. And it shows that even though he was best known and almost solely known, really, for carving in marble, he was very, very proud, I think, of his ability to model in clay, as you can see in this wonderful portrait, which was painted by the great neoclassical woman artist and a friend of Canova's, Angelica Kaufmann. These are some of his early terracottas. This and the following work that you'll see we were unable to secure for the exhibition, unfortunately, due to their conservation status. This was a work which was produced by Canova as a competition piece in Venice. And they were all supposed to sculpt a version of The Wrestlers. This is an ancient composition. It was very well known at the time. There was a plaster in a famous art collection in Venice called the Farsetti collection, which Canova would have seen. And so he has basically copied that very carefully. This is not a loosely modeled sketch. This is a very finished model. It's also been painted white by the artist to emulate marble, I think. Now, somehow he only won second prize for this. I'm not entirely sure how, because it looks pretty good to me. So, you know, but it's a great example of an early work and the sort of thing that artists were doing very early on in their careers, which was copying, particularly in this moment, works from the antique. Here you see one of his own compositions from around that time. This was his acceptance piece for the Venetian Academy of Art. So when he was accepted to enter the Academy as a member, he was required to produce a work to give to them. And this is what he did, very much modeled after antique works of art, and that's what makes him a neoclassical artist. And this is a standing Apollo. Again, very highly finished, and in this case also given a varnish and paint over the top of it. This is the earliest piece in the exhibition, produced while the artist, again, was in Venice. It's highly finished. It was a commission by a senator in Venice because he wanted a bust of his very best friend, the Doge. And you can see how finely worked this terracotta is, how carefully modeled. I love the way that he's evoked the fur, all the individual strands of fur on the costume of the Doge, and the way in which he has somehow inscribed all that embroidery on the Doge's cap. This work I discovered when we were installing it, and we had a courier here from the Lending Museum. This work has a hilarious story in a way. It was produced by Canova for the senator so that he could have a portrait of his best friend, the Doge. And they did have a falling out soon after, though, because the senator was upset that the Doge was not giving him political favors. And so one night, in a fit of rage, he picked up the terracotta, threw it outside where it smashed into pieces, and then he instructed his servants to relieve themselves on it. The moral of the story is don't anger an Italian, I guess. But thankfully, someone must have kept the pieces, and it was beautifully conserved, and you can see it looking almost perfect in the exhibition today. In 1779, Canova moves to Rome. Now, that's the place you want to be as an artist in that moment. It was the capital of the art world. It was a place where you could see the best contemporary art, but you could also see huge amounts of the greatest works that had been recovered from Greek and Roman antiquity. In his journal, he describes taking classes during the day where figures, live models would be set up in various poses, and you would copy them by drawing or by painting or by modeling in clay. And he made, there is one journal entry of the time where he says, "Today I went to the academy and they had set up a figure posed as Jesus on the crucifixion." And he said, and I modeled it in clay. And this might very well be that work. We think it dates to around the first year of Canova's time in Rome. And it has a sense of being modeled from life, particularly the emphasis given here to the musculature of the body. I love the facial expression. This is not a huge work. It's about this big. These details can be deceptive. You sense so much about the emotions of the figures he sculpts, of what their bodies are doing. And he really is, he's doing it with the tiniest tools and the slightest marks. It really and truly is amazing. He also tells us in his journal about the hazards of working in clay. These are portable, these are things you have to carry around with you. And he discusses in his journal moments when one day he accidentally left one of his models on a boat when he got off and went home. And another day he tripped going up the stairs and one of his models fell to the floor and broke. These are all part and parcel of the process of working in clay. Everyone was surprised when this young and unproven sculptor who just arrived in Rome received an important commission for a funerary monument commissioned by the Catholic Church, a monument to Pope Clement XIV. And it was commissioned for the Roman Church of Santi Apostoli. As you can see, it is truly monumental. Right here, right here is a huge doorway for people to go through. So that gives you some sense, I think, of just how large these figures are. The whole thing was designed by Canova, carved in marble. It took 4 years to produce this. And at this time, he really didn't have a gigantic workshop of assistants to help him. But this began as works in clay. And we have a number of these in the exhibition, and they are in various levels of finish. So, for example, an early idea for this figure of piety or a mourning figure is this little terracotta in the exhibition. It's about that big, about 4 inches high, and it's incredible what he is able to, the emotion he is able to express in this work, while working very, very quickly. And then you have more finished models for the central portrait figure of Clement XIV, and discarded idea for another mourning figure that's also highly finished. So you can see here just how quickly he's working in this in the clay, and how just even a few marks can give you the sense of voluminous drapery that's encompassing this woman. The idea of the shadows underneath the hood, which give it such an air of mystery. This is a much more finished piece for the central figure, and it's what we call a presentation model. Now, presentation models were produced in very, very carefully, finely finished, so that they could be presented to the commissioners of the work, to show the commissioners what the work would eventually look like when it was produced on a large scale and in very, very, very expensive marble. This work was painted white, and I suspect it was to enhance the idea for the commissioners of what it would look like in marble. And it's covered in pencil marks and red crosses, which attest to its use as an object, as a useful object within the studio, and indicating various points on the surface that were used as measuring, in order to measure up into a larger version. And this, again, finely finished, discarded idea for that monument, the Piety, which I think is one of the most incredible works in the exhibition. Again, it's not very large. And the level of detail that the artist has given to this work, the individual folds of the fabric that cascade down to the floor. She's sort of columnar because of these lines of fabric, and it's unbelievable the way in which you can sense her entire body underneath that drapery. This is a very difficult thing to do, and he truly was a master. Now, the critical success of the monument to Clement XIV led to a stream of new commissions that continued for the rest of Canova's career. He developed a very busy and crowded workshop filled with many specialized laborers. It was almost like a factory, and he was kind of like the captain of the ship. Individual tasks were carried out by specialists in individual activities. There were specialists who made plaster casts of his clay sketches and models. There were assistants who worked on measuring apparatuses that enabled him to scale up his compositions from small to colossal. All of his marbles were mostly carved by assistants. But what they left at the very end, and this is why Canova's marbles were so famous and sought after, they left what was called the skin at the end. And it was a few millimeters more than what the composition would actually end up being. And that's when Canova would step in and undertake the arduous and obsessive task of chiseling, carving, rubbing the surface of a marble to get it to the level of finish that you see in his works today. So Canova is very much at the beginning and the end of the process. At the beginning with his clay sketch, and at the end when he comes in to finish the marble. You might wonder how he gets from a small sketch to a completed large-scale marble. And it's a multi-step process. And again, it's fairly difficult to put into words, so I'm hoping you will enjoy seeing it in action in the videos in the exhibition. So here we have an initial, very quick sketch for his composition, The Three Graces. And this would have been done, I suspect, in about an hour. He would have been racing, and just to get down the idea that was in his head. Then he starts to refine the composition, and you get a slightly larger and slightly more finished version of the composition. Then the work is gradually scaled up with increasingly larger clay models. From each of those clay models, a plaster cast is taken. And in the process of taking the plaster cast, the original clay is destroyed. From that life-size plaster cast, the composition is transferred into marble via various means, measuring tools, calipers, plumb lines hanging from frames above the plaster and the marble block. We, in the exhibition, will be able to show you a few moments where you can follow the process almost from beginning to end, and particularly here in the case of Canova's wonderful portrait of Napoleon's mother, Laetitia Bonaparte, known as Madame Mère. And in the exhibition, you will see two small sketches in clay, then a mid-sized plaster, and then finally the finished marble itself. I'm extremely excited to show to you the finished marble of Madame Mère. It is one of the best preserved marbles that we have today by Canova, and this is because it was purchased fairly early on in its life by the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. They purchased it in 1818 at a sort of Napoleonic fire sale in Paris, and it was shipped to England, and then it's remained there ever since. This is the first time that this work has left England, and it's a wonder to behold, particularly in the round, because in Chatsworth, it's always been pressed up against a wall. So now you can really see just how perfect it is in 360. Now, Laetitia Bonaparte must have been quite a figure. She commissioned this work herself. In Rome, she met with Canova in 1805, and then he spent 2 years producing the finished marble. It was sent to Paris, and it was exhibited at the Paris Salon, where it gained great critical acclaim, possibly also because people had to be nice to Napoleon at the time. So, and anyway, when it was finished being exhibited, Laetitia said to Napoleon, "Son, I want this installed in your palace in the Tuileries, opposite your throne." And he said, "Absolutely not." I think he really didn't want Mum looking at him all day long. And so he had it placed in storage. And so it never really saw the light of day until 1818, when the Devonshires acquired it. This is another extraordinary marble in the exhibition, and it is the Penitent Magdalene. It has a wonderful history of reception. I think it's one of the most sensual nudes of the late 18th and 19th centuries. It shows the Magdalene in prayer, repentant, in the wilderness, alongside a skull that evokes vanitas, and contemplating what was once a gilded cross. And you're probably wondering, how did that marble move from a plaster? How was it born from a plaster? And this is what you will see in the exhibition. This is a plaster, a life-size plaster for the upper half of the Penitent Magdalene. And you'll see all these bronze or brass nails that have been hammered in at various points on the surface of the plaster. These are the measuring points that are used by the sculptors, the practitioners, in order to transfer the composition to the marble block. They allow you, with the use of calipers, plumb lines, to be able to measure the distances that you have to carve into so that you don't carve too far. Because if you carve too far in a marble, there's no way of getting it back again. It's a subtractive process. But they're also, I think, the pathos of these objects with these nails hammered into them, they're really quite beautiful and aesthetic, I think, in their own right. Unlike his clay sketches, Canova's marbles take refinement to its technical and conceptual limit. In work such as Napoleon's Mother, and here, Cupid revived by Psyche's kiss, the surface of the marble varies so greatly as the eye passes over it. Canova's taken extreme advantage of the peculiar properties of the stone. Its remarkable potential for simultaneously evoking reflection, translucence, opacity, flesh, hair, fabric are all meticulously delineated by their varying qualities of finish. There's a misconception that Canova's marbles are just the same the whole way over the surface. And many sculptors were like that at the time. Many sculptors, indeed, didn't even carve their own marbles. They had many practitioners to do everything for them. But it was Canova who was the unique individual at that time who really came in and almost fetishistically worked with the surface of the stone. And I think you can see here what I mean when I say that Canova's process was one of refinement. This is an early sketch for Cupid revived by Psyche's kiss, and it is just full of energy and emotion. You know, it's not that sort of, it's not the still, gracefully interlocked, you know, figures that you see in the finished product. Here he's in a frenzy, getting his idea down. So it's much more raw in a way. And you can see how he's just, the heads and the hair on the heads are just little pellets of clay that have been mashed onto the surface. And then he's raked all over the surface with a toothed tool at the end, which gives it these sort of vectors which lead your eye all over it. And gradually in the process of leading up to the marble, all of that energy will be distilled, refined into a very different finished product. You see the same thing here with the Penitent Magdalene. The little sketch on the left is one of my absolute favorites. It's his very first idea for the Penitent Magdalene. And it's so raw, it's almost formless. You know, with just a few marks, a few pressings, he has created something that you can easily understand as a kneeling woman. You can feel the weight of her arms as they press down on her thighs. And I love the way in which this composition has been produced in clay. In some ways, it's entirely more appropriate to be produced in clay because the objection of the Magdalene on the earth itself seems so perfectly encaptured by the material that Canova is using. Of course, the marble itself is also extraordinary in its own right and for other reasons, and I hope you'll enjoy seeing them in the exhibition. This is a marble from the Art Institute, and again, it shows you the ways in which Canova was so brilliant at carving in stone. He scrupulously delineated flesh, hair. The tight ringlets of Paris's hair have a relatively dry appearance. Their incisions and drill marks catching in the light. In contrast, the planes of his face are smoother and his cap more polished. When you see it in person, the cap looks like soft fabric and like you could reach out and squeeze it. Additionally, there are light crisscross marks of the sculptor's rasp that are left visible across his chest. You know, all these subtle differences enliven the surface of the marble and suggest various textures and degrees of softness. Here are some details of some of Canova's sculptures, and I think you can see here the very different techniques that he's using in different parts of a composition. Now, if the marbles invite ever closer scrutiny of fragmented details like you see here, the clay sketches move us in precisely the other direction. Although we can become absorbed in the surfaces of the quick clay sketches, our eyes tracing the artist's fingerprints and tool marks, the sketches are fundamentally expansive. Their abbreviated visual language compels us to complete their compositions, to imagine and apprehend the totality of their forms. So what then ultimately was the relationship between Canova's work in clay and marble? The two materials could not be more different, one soft, the other hard, one matte and opaque, the other offering more complex lighting effects, one enabling an additive and comparatively quick process, the other subtractive and necessarily more laborious. Clay and marble were the alpha and omega of the sculptor's practice. They represented, respectively, idea and execution, beginning and end. Even so, the finished marbles retained something of the memory of clay's manipulability. In his pursuit of pliability in marble, in his desire for stone to become flesh, Canova seemingly translated the defining quality of one medium into another. Clay was never simply a technically expedient medium for Canova. On the contrary, clay carried a poetic and conceptual charge that suffused his entire practice with its sensuous qualities. Thank you very much. Now, I think we have time for some questions, if anybody has any. Oh, yes. Hang on, I think someone will come down with a microphone for you. No, someone's coming to you.
Here you go. I would like to find out if there is armature inside of the clay sculptures.
So when Canova started producing the full-scale clay model, he had to have an armature because the structure was, sometimes 3 meters, 4 meters high, the composition. And so he did have an armature inside. It was made of wood and metal, and it was a basic frame on which he piled the clay. And that's one of the reasons why he couldn't fire his full-scale clay works, because they would have blown up in the kiln. And that was why plaster casts were taken of them, and why the clay model was destroyed in that process of producing the plaster cast. Now, plaster is a much more useful material in the studio. It survives a lot better, repeated use and movement, and so it was a very, very useful medium for Canova. And it also had aesthetic properties of its own. It could give you some kind of sense of marble because of its color. And so, he would often give plasters as gifts to friends, or even sell them as cheaper versions of, what otherwise would have been a very, very expensive marble. Yes, down in the front row. I think we've got someone coming with a microphone.
You showed the Cupid and Psyche. There is two of those. I saw one at the Hermitage and one at the Louvre. Do they use the same clay base to make two of them? And how did that happen?
So this is where the plaster in the studio becomes very important. So Canova will keep the full-scale plaster in his own studio, so that if somebody requests another version, he has that plaster there to work with. And that's why all those plasters are in his museum in Posano, because he kept them all, not just to record his history or as a repository of ideas, but as working tools if somebody came into the studio and said, I want one of those. So yes, there are two versions of the Cupid and Psyche. There's one at the Louvre, and there is one at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Same with the Three Graces. The first version, commissioned by Josephine Bonaparte, is at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the second version again is at the Hermitage. Yes. No worries.
Thank you.
Just over there. Canova would have been, the question was, did he copy Bernini? He would have been very aware of Bernini, who was a sculptor working, a century and a half before him in Rome. So as Canova went around the city, went to churches, he would have been, I think, very struck by Bernini's works. I mean, Bernini was the greatest sculptor before Canova, and so he would have taken a very special interest, I think, in Bernini's compositions, his practice. Canova was seeking something different to Bernini. Bernini very much was trying to bring everything to life, even more than Canova was. And he was much more in a Baroque vein. So, you get much more emotion in Bernini's work. Canova was a neoclassicist. So he is looking extremely carefully at the antique. And what he is trying to do is emulate the gracefulness, in some ways, sometimes the stillness, and the perfection and the idealism of antique Greek and Roman forms. But he's also seeking to compete with them. And so Canova was the only artist, the only sculptor that was thought to have, in his lifetime, surpassed the antique, which was, I think, his goal. Yes, just here on the side.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, in the last question you were mentioning how someone might come into his studio and say, I want one of those. Was there a policy on editioning where, once he had finished a commission, he was not allowed to reproduce certain figures, or how did that work?
It's a really good question. I mean, we didn't really have copyright then. And Paul Canova never really had copyright. I mean, you can go to multiple, I think, people's backyards and gardens today and see the Three Graces in all manner of materials. But it depended on the patron, and sometimes they would get in fights with the artist because there were patrons who would say, I don't want you to make another version of this. And of course, the sculptor, that's what they want to do because it's much easier. The composition's already there to work from. And it also promotes, it publicizes certain compositions as well. So no, I mean, other patrons didn't really care. Or they could say, I have the first one, or something like that. And sometimes Canova would make minute, small adjustments to the sculptures. The Three Graces, for example, there's a sort of column that one of them is leaning against, and he's created that column differently and given it different decoration in each of the two versions. The bust of Paris in our own collection, I think I had it. Can't find it now. The bust of Paris, that's one of about 12 different versions. And it is also drawn from a full-length figure of Paris. So the head became so popular that he started making just the head as well. Our head is very special, though. It's if you turn it around, it's inscribed personally by Canova on the back, and it's a gift. It was a gift by him to the greatest French art critic at the time, Quatremer de Cancy, who was one of Canova's best friends. So from artist to critic, I think is just one of the most beautiful things. And so yes, ours is a little more special.
We have one here in the back.
At the Camille Claudel talk that you gave, you said Rodin did not do his own marbles, which shocked, I think, everyone. So did Rodin finish the last few? No, not at all?
No.
Oh.
I mean, he carefully oversaw, but he didn't touch. And it was the same around 1800 with what was the person who was thought to be Canova's rival, but I don't think there was really much question about it, who was named Thorvaldsen, who was a great sculptor in his own right, for sure. He was Danish, but working in Rome. Also had a gigantic studio, many commissions. But he didn't take any care with the surface or with the finishing of a marble, really. Sometimes a little bit, but for the most part, he left it all to the practitioners to do. So you know, the idea of Canova coming in and laboriously working the surface himself was one of the selling points for his work with patrons. And it also explains why their surfaces are so much more sensuous than any other marbles by anybody else in the period. Yes,
How
up the
much do we
back.
know about Canova's personal life, his relationships, temperament? Do we have a lot of detail on that?
Yeah, I mean, he was considered to be a very affable person, and he never married. So I don't know precisely. We have a few apocryphal stories about, you know, women that supposedly he fell in love with and were his muse, but they were sort of created in the 19th century, later 19th century. So we don't know a whole lot about that. He was close to his brother, and it was his brother to whom pretty much everything was bequeathed when he died, and it was his brother who set up the museum in Pusano. We know that he retained a very, very strong attachment to his birthplace of the Veneto, and that's why the museum was built in Pusano. Toward the end of his life, he must have been very wealthy from all the commissions, and he designed and had built a gigantic church which is shaped like the Pantheon in Rome, the ancient building, and it was designed as the place where he would be buried. And he is buried there today. Well, part of him is buried there today. Just like saints in Christianity, when Canova died, people wanted a piece of him, literally. So his hand went to the Academy in Venice, his right hand. His heart went into a tomb in the Church of the Frari in Venice. And then the rest of the body went to the other tomb up in Pusano. Canova was deeply, he was one of probably the first artists to really think in a particular way about conserving sculpture. So he was asked by the British to come and conserve the Parthenon marbles when they were in England. And there's a famous series of letters that Canova wrote where he basically refused to and said that, you know, to intervene in these works in the way that you're suggesting, essentially recarving parts of them, is not historically accurate, and it would destroy the original, authentic work itself, which is, in many ways, the way that conservation theory has developed through to this day. So he was really a forerunner in that regard. He was also served as a kind of diplomat at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. He was sent over by the Italian government to start negotiating and choosing or retrieving works from Italy that Napoleon had looted. And he was quite successful. He didn't get everything, obviously. You just have to go to the Louvre. But he was very successful in getting many, many important works back to Rome. So, you know, in Italy, he really is, for all these reasons, he is a towering figure. And this exhibition comes at the end of what has been a year and a half, at least, of bicentenary celebrations in Italy for the bicentenary of the death of Canova.
Emerson, we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
Got your first one right here, actually.
Is the statue of Napoleon Bonaparte's mother carved from a single block of marble?
Yes.
Even though the leg, the whole thing.
The whole thing.
What about the statue of Psyche? That's a single block.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. They're all single blocks. That was what you expected from a great sculptor. But it also shows just how risky this process was, because you make one mistake and it's all over. And it's a lot of money down the drain. One more. Yes.
Hi, I had a question about the Reviving Kiss clay
Yes.
sketches. So one of them, it looks like it's more of an embrace, and then another one, it looks like it's more of a fight. And so I was wondering in what way, if any, the person who commissioned the pieces impacted the sketches.
They often could. I mean, they would say, I want this subject matter, but, you know, Canova became so important that in the end, people would often sort of let him decide what he wanted. What you're seeing, what you're talking about are the two clay sketches for the Cupid revived by Psyche's Kiss in the exhibition. And they are, you know, very different to the finished product. And as you say, they're sort of different from each other. And I think with these really early sketches, I don't know if he precisely had Cupid revived by Psyche's Kiss in his mind as a subject matter. Because, as you said, in the sketchiest work, the figures seem to be fighting each other, and the male figure seems to be pushing away from the female figure, and that's not at all the story of Psyche revived by of Cupid and Psyche. So he may have had something else in mind, but it was the formal qualities that he developed into the subject that we have today.
Thank you.
No worries. Well, thank you very much. I'm so grateful to you all.